There's a moment, and every soldier who's lived long enough knows this moment, where the battlefield goes quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Wrong quiet. The kind where your body figures out what's happening about 3 seconds before your brain catches up. I've been in 17 engagements across 4 star systems. I've seen Kreth berserkers charge through plasma walls. I've watched a Veldrani cruiser break apart in low orbit and rain fire across an entire continent like some kind of metal meteor shower. I've lost people whose names I still say before I sleep, just to make sure I don't forget them. But nothing, in any of those 17 engagements prepared me for what I watched happen in Sector 9 of the Marath Station battle theater. Because what I saw that day wasn't a weapon system, wasn't a tactical maneuver, wasn't even a soldier in any conventional sense. What I saw was a man, just one man, do something so precise, so methodical, so utterly calm, that the Galactic Coalition forces watching from the ridge on our left flank stopped firing. Just stopped. And watched. Even the enemy, even they hesitated. Because what Corporal Darren Voss did that afternoon in the ruins of Sector 9 wasn't something you could put in a battle report. Wasn't something the Coalition brass would know how to classify. What he did had a name, though. An old name. The kind of name that doesn't translate well into galactic standard, because most species in the Coalition never had to invent it. The kind of name humans have been carrying since before we ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was looking back. Reaper. And by the time General Vaeltha Sarin, the alien woman who had trusted him, assigned him, vouched for him, understood what she had placed at the center of her battle formation, it was already too late to stop him. It was already too late to stop any of it. Set up. Let me tell you about Marath Station first, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what happened there. Marath Station wasn't originally a military installation. It was a trade hub, one of those sprawling, multi-tiered orbital platforms that the old Coalition built back when everybody was still optimistic about galactic commerce. 7 rings, each one rotating at a slightly different speed, each one housing a different species district with its own atmospheric blend, its own gravity setting, its own little pocket of home for traders who'd been in the void too long. Beautiful in a way, the kind of place that made you believe for a minute that the universe had figured something out. Then the choir found it. I'm not going to spend time explaining the choir right now. If you don't know what the choir is, you're lucky and you should enjoy that luck while it lasts. What I'll tell you is this: they don't negotiate. They don't communicate in any language we've been able to fully crack. They move in formations that don't follow any tactical logic we can model, and they hit hard enough and fast enough that by the time a standard Coalition defense grid gets oriented, there's usually nothing left worth defending. Marath Station had been partially evacuated when the choir advance scouts showed up on long-range sensors. Partially, which meant there were still roughly 4,000 civilians, traders, dockworkers, children, people who hadn't moved fast enough or hadn't believed it was real until the outer ring started burning, trapped in the lower districts when the main choir formation arrived. The Coalition response was standard: deploy a rapid insertion force, hold the inner rings long enough for evacuation transports to reach the civilian clusters, buy time with bodies if necessary. General Vaeltha Sarin was the commanding officer. She was Saratai, which meant she stood about 2.5 meters tall, moved with that fluid, almost liquid grace that all Saratai have, and had 4 eyes arranged in a slight arc across her face, each one capable of independent focus. She'd been a Coalition general for over 30 of their years, which translated to something like 50 human years, and she had a reputation that preceded her into every briefing room like a second presence. Tactically brilliant, coldly efficient, respects results, not species. That last part was important. It was why she'd integrated human forces into her rapid insertion units at all. Most senior Coalition commanders still treated human soldiers like useful but slightly unpredictable equipment, the kind of thing you deployed carefully and kept away from diplomats. Vaeltha didn't have that bias, or at least she disciplined herself out of it. She looked at what humans did, and she made decisions based on that. Which was how Corporal Darren Voss ended up assigned to her command. I need to describe Darren for you, because the way he looked matters. He wasn't physically imposing. That's the first thing people always got wrong about him. When you hear what he was capable of, you picture someone built like a siege weapon, big, heavy, loud with muscle. Darren was none of those things. He was medium height, medium build. The kind of face you'd forget in a crowd, brown eyes that were maybe a shade too calm for the situation around them, hands that were always still even when everything else wasn't. He moved quietly, not sneaky quiet, just economical. Like every step was exactly as long as it needed to be and not a centimeter more. He'd been a hospice nurse before the choir arrived. I know. Hold that thought, you'll need it later. He'd enlisted in the Human Defense Forces 3 weeks after the choir's first verified contact with a human colony, a place called Vendra's Hope, which doesn't exist anymore. He went through training in a way his instructors described as unsettling. Not because he struggled, because he didn't. He absorbed everything they gave him like he was simply remembering things he'd already known. And he asked questions about edge cases and failure scenarios that made the instructors pause and check their own manuals. He qualified expert in 4 different weapon systems in the same testing cycle. He never bragged about it, never mentioned it. By the time he ended up on Marath Station, he'd been in 6 engagements, and in all 6 of them, he had never once been the highest-ranking human in the unit. He was always corporal, always that quiet guy in the middle of the formation who you noticed, because he was somehow always exactly where he needed to be before you realized you needed someone there. General Vailtha had reviewed his file twice before she requested him specifically. She told her aide, and this got around the way things do, I want the one who came back from all 6. I don't care about his rank. I care that he came back. What she didn't fully appreciate yet, what none of the coalition brass had fully appreciated yet, was how he came back. We inserted into Marath Station through the maintenance corridors in Ring 4. I should clarify that. My name is Sergeant Ola Brennan, 3rd Coalition Human Integration Force, attached to General Vailtha's Rapid Insertion Unit for the Marath operation. I was squad leader for a mixed-species fire team. Myself, 2 humans named Torchek and Wilsey, a Saratai scout named Vel who went by Vel because none of us could pronounce his actual name, and Darren Voss. We were one of 6 teams inserting simultaneously. The plan was to push through Ring 4, establish a perimeter at the civilian cluster coordinates in Ring 3, hold long enough for the evacuation transports, which were coming in from the station's docking arm on the far side, to load up and clear. Simple as plans go. Except by the time we were 200 meters into Ring 4's maintenance corridor. It was clear the choir had already moved deeper into the station than the sensor readings suggested. The corridor was dark, not station power outage dark, the kind of dark that means something has been eating the light sources. The walls were covered in that black filament material the choir leaves behind, which does something to ambient light that our xenobiologists still don't agree on. It absorbed it, scattered it, or just made you feel like you were seeing less than you were take your pick. The temperature was wrong. Too cold for Ring 4, which should have been maintained at a human comfortable range because it was a mixed commerce district. And the sound. The choir makes a sound when they're active. I've heard it described as harmonics, as infrasound, as a vibration that sits just below the frequency you can consciously process. What I'll tell you is that it felt like something was humming inside your bones, not outside your body, and it made your hands want to shake if you let yourself focus on it. Torchek was already gripping his rifle too tight. I could see his knuckles from where I was walking. Wilsey had gone into that focused, slightly detached state he used as a coping mechanism. Eyes forward, breathing through his nose, running some private mental checklist. Vel was doing fine. Saratai don't process infrasound the same way humans do. Lucky him. Darren was walking like he was taking a stroll. I'm not being metaphorical. His pace was steady and unhurried. His rifle was up, but with that relaxed, practiced positioning that meant it could come to bear in about a quarter second. His head moved slowly, taking in the corridor in sections, left wall, ceiling, right wall, floor, repeat. Corporal, I said quietly, falling into step beside him. You good? He looked at me. Those 2 calm brown eyes. Yeah, he said. The sound bothering you. A pause, like he had to think about whether it was. I know what it is, he said. Once you know what something is, it's harder for it to bother you. I didn't have a response to that, We kept moving. We found the first choir unit about 400 meters in. 7 of them, which is a standard choir scouting formation. They were clustered around what had been a junction in the maintenance corridor, a wider space where several passages met. And they were doing something with the walls. Installing filament, maybe, or interfacing with the station's internal systems through some method we'd never successfully documented. They hadn't noticed us yet. The standard protocol in that situation is radio your position, request guidance from command, hold unless engaged. What Darren did was, he looked at them for about 4 seconds, then looked at me. Permission to handle this quietly, he said. Quiet, as in no gunfire, because gunfire would alert every other choir unit within acoustic range, and we didn't know yet how many were between us and the civilian cluster. Quietly, I said, keeping my voice level, means what exactly? Means I handle it quietly, he said. Give me 90 seconds. I want you to understand that I had no good reason to say yes to that. Standard protocol existed precisely to prevent individual soldiers from making unilateral decisions in contact situations. 90 seconds was a long time when the choir was involved, and I barely knew this man. But there was something in the way he said it, not confidence exactly, because confidence can be bluster, and this wasn't that. This was the same tone a very experienced doctor uses when they say, "I've seen this before." The tone of someone who isn't guessing. 90 seconds, I said, then I pull you back. He handed me his rifle. And then he moved into the corridor junction, like something that didn't have a heartbeat. I'm not going to describe what he did in clinical detail, because I've given enough debriefs about it, and the clinical detail isn't what mattered. What mattered was how it looked from where I was standing. It looked impossibly quiet. It looked like he understood something about how the choir moved, about their timing, their reactive patterns, the angles they covered and the ones they didn't, that our tactical briefings had never articulated clearly. He moved through them like he was navigating a room full of sleeping people, like he'd memorized the floor plan and knew where every piece of furniture was. 90 seconds. 7 choir scouts. No sound. He walked back to me and took his rifle back and looked at Torchek and Wilsey, who were both staring with expressions I can only describe as their brain trying to file a report it doesn't have the right forms for. Junction's clear, Darren said. We should keep moving. Vel looked at him with all 4 of his independently focused eyes for a long moment. Human, Vel said, what exactly did you do before the war? Darren almost smiled, almost. I was in healthcare, he said. We kept moving. Build tension. We made contact with General Veltha's command element in Ring 3, at a position she'd established in what had been a commercial depot, big enough to serve as a staging area, defensible on 3 sides with one open approach that her Saratai scouts could cover. She was standing in the middle of the depot looking at a holographic tactical display that floated at about chest height, her 4 eyes tracking different parts of the map simultaneously. Up close, Veltha was, I'll say this carefully, impressive in the way that very dangerous things are impressive. She was Saratai, so she had that quality where everything about her physical presence communicated precision. Even standing still, she looked like she was making 3 decisions. She looked at my team when we came in, cataloged us in about 2 seconds. Then her gaze moved to Darren and stayed there slightly longer than it had on anyone else. Corporal Voss, she said. Her galactic standard was perfect, no accent, no hesitation. The Saratai are gifted linguists. Your team's approach corridor had 7 choir contacts on my forward sensors. Yes, sir, Darren said. My sensors stopped registering them 4 minutes ago. Yes, sir. She studied him. You didn't report contact. We were under communication blackout protocol because of the choir's signal intercept capability, Darren said. And it was handled quickly enough that a report would have taken longer than the situation. She looked at me. Sergeant Brennan, she said, accurate. Accurate, I said. She made a decision I could see happen, some small shift in her posture, some recalibration. Understood, she said, and then she went back to her display. It was only later that I'd look back at that exchange and realize that was the moment she decided to trust him. Not the file review, not the mission record, not the glowing words from his previous commanding officers. That exchange, that calm. She'd been looking for a specific quality, and she recognized it when she saw it. What she hadn't understood, what none of us understood yet, was that the quality she'd recognized had two sides to it, and she'd only ever seen one. The situation at the civilian cluster was worse than the pre-insertion briefing had indicated. The 4,000 civilians we'd been told about had apparently been joined by another 600 from the outer ring evacuation, people who'd moved inward when the outer ring started burning, using the maintenance corridors to reach what they thought was a safer section. So now we were looking at roughly 4,600 people crammed into a depot complex in Ring 3 that was designed for cargo processing, not shelter. They were scared, obviously, but they were holding together. There were coalition civilian coordinators among them, a few station security personnel who'd been caught in the lockdown, and the human instinct to organize in the face of catastrophe had apparently asserted itself, because someone had set up a sort of triage area for the injured and established feeding rotations for the rations that had been in the depot. The problem was the choir. The problem was always the choir. 3 separate choir formations had been identified approaching the civilian cluster's position from different vectors. The largest formation, estimated at 40+ units, was pressing in from Ring 2 through the upper passages. The other 2 were smaller, maybe 12 to 15 units each, working through maintenance corridors on the east and west flanks. And the evacuation transports were still 45 minutes out. 45 minutes is a long time. Here's what I have, General Vailtha said, addressing the assembled unit leaders. 93 combat personnel, 4,600 civilians to protect, 3 inbound formations with the primary threat approaching from the north quadrant, 45 minutes before extraction window. She paused, the holographic display rotated slowly, the 3 red formation markers pulsing at regular intervals. Standard defensive posture gives us a coverage gap on the east flank. We cannot adequately cover 3 approach vectors with 93 personnel without thinning our coverage to a point that becomes tactically inviable. She looked around the room. I need solutions. The unit leaders talked. Options were proposed, rejected, modified. The Saratai tactical officer suggested a retreat to a more defensible interior position, which would reduce our coverage perimeter but also reduce the civilians' proximity to the extraction point. A Keth officer, heavyset species, built like they were made of compressed stone, proposed drawing the 2 smaller formations into a convergence kill zone, which had merit but required personnel we couldn't spare. Darren Voss was standing at the back of the room. He wasn't a unit leader. He shouldn't have been in this briefing at all. I'd brought him in honestly because I wasn't sure why. Because in the corridor, when those 7 choir scouts had been neutralized in 90 seconds, I'd had the irrational but persistent instinct that this man should be in the room where decisions were made. He was looking at the holographic display. Not at it in the way most soldiers look at tactical displays, scanning it for information, for the specifics of distances and personnel markers. He was looking at it the way someone looks at a problem they already understand and are simply confirming they understand correctly. General Vailtha noticed. Her gaze shifted to him, stayed there. You, she said, Corporal, you have something to say. It wasn't a question. Darren looked up from the display. The east flank corridor, the maintenance passage at grid reference 774. It's a bottleneck. 40 centimeters wide at the narrowest point, 63 meters long. If someone holds that passage, the eastern formation can't bring more than 2 units to bear at a time regardless of how many they have. Silence. That's a position with no lateral cover and no exit, Vailtha said. Anyone assigned to hold that passage would face a sustained engagement at close range with no possibility of reinforcement. Yes, sir, Darren said. More silence. You're proposing that someone hold it anyway, Vailtha said. Someone has to, Darren said. If the east flank breaks, the civilian cluster's exposure time extends past the extraction window. The math doesn't work any other way. She studied him. And who, she said very carefully, are you proposing for that position? He looked at her. I'll do it, he said. I want to tell you what I expected to happen next. I expected the general to tell him no. to assign a full squad to the passage, or to pull back the perimeter, or to do something with the resources she had that didn't involve sending one man alone into a 63-meter kill corridor. What she did was look at him for a long time. And then she said, "Walk me through what you'd need." Not yes, not approval, just walk me through it. He did. He described a positioning approach that used the corridor's geometry against the choir's typical movement patterns. He described the specific systems he'd want to carry, not for firepower, but for what he called management of the engagement space. He used that phrase, management of the engagement space, like it was a room he was going to be tidying up. He described in calm and specific language how he estimated the engagement would progress, what the choir would attempt, and how he intended to respond to each phase. Vailtha listened to all of it without interrupting. Her 4 eyes were completely still, all of them focused on him, which for a Saratai is a significant thing. They're most focused when most alert, and most alert when something has genuinely gotten their full attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You understand," she said, "that the probability of survival for anyone holding that position." "I understand the math," he said. "Then why?" He looked at the display again, at the civilian cluster marker, 4,600 people. "Because I can do it," he said. "Most people can't, it's not complicated." She made a sound that didn't have a clean translation. It was Saratai, something between agreement and sorrow, maybe, like watching something inevitable happen. She assigned him to the east flank passage. She gave him everything he'd asked for. And I only found this out later from her aide, she spent 4 minutes reviewing his personnel file again. Looking, I think, for some detail she'd missed, some footnote that would explain what she was dealing with. She found the hospice nurse entry. I was told she sat with that for a while. Climax. I want to be honest with you about the next part. I wasn't there. I wasn't in the passage. Everything I know about what happened in that 63-meter corridor comes from 3 sources. The positioning sensors General Vailtha had placed on both ends of the passage, the debrief Darren gave afterward, which was brief and precise and characteristically short on anything that sounded like drama, and what the choir survivors, and yes, there were survivors, I'll get to that, appeared to have transmitted back to their main formation, judging by the way the main formation's behavior changed. So I'm stitching together a picture. I'm doing my best. Here's what I know. Darren entered the east flank passage at 14:22 station time. He was carrying a pulse carbine, accurate, quiet, low recoil, designed for enclosed spaces. He was carrying a number of what the equipment manifest listed as area denial devices, not explosives, but the kind of deployable units that create environmental interference in a space. Scramble emissions that disrupt the choir's coordination signaling. Thermal signature maskers. 2 atmospheric canisters of a dense chemical compound that reduced visibility in an enclosed space to about 30 centimeters. He was carrying a sidearm, a knife, and a small device that nobody on the manifest had been able to fully categorize, which Darren had pulled from his personal kit and requested permission to use, which Vailtha had approved because at that point she was approving everything he asked for. The device turned out to be something he'd built himself. I'll come back to that. The first part of the engagement, according to the sensors, looked like a standard defensive hold. The choir's eastern formation entered the passage approximately 18 minutes after Darren took his position. They came in the way the choir usually comes in, not in a rush, but in a steady, inexorable press, like water finding the level, like something that doesn't recognize the concept of stopping. The front units took fire, they went down. The formation adjusted, as the choir always adjusts, and kept moving. They encountered the first area denial device at the 12-meter mark. The scramble emission it generated disrupted their coordination signal for about 40 seconds. In those 40 seconds, they stopped moving in their fluid, coordinated way and became something more like individuals, which is apparently much worse for the choir than it is for anyone else. Darren used that 40 seconds. Then the formation recovered and pressed forward again. The second area denial device went off at the 20-meter mark. Then the atmospheric canisters, the visibility compound deployed into the passage, turning the central 60% of the corridor into a dense, opaque cloud. The choir's coordination system works partially through optical signaling. We've known this for a while. It's one of the reasons they're so difficult to engage in low-light conditions, because they adapt. But adapt takes time. In a visibility zero environment, in a narrow passage, with their coordination signal being periodically disrupted. They stopped being able to predict him. And Darren Voss, moving through a cloud so thick you couldn't see 30 centimeters in any direction, with the choir all around him. The sensors showed heat signatures and movement. They showed 17 minutes of sustained contact. They showed the choir formation, which had entered the passage with 14 units, eventually stop. Not stop to regroup. Just stop. The sensors showed Darren walking back out the command end of the passage at 14:47. 25 minutes. 14 choir units. One manned. He was still upright. He was bleeding from a laceration across his left forearm where some choir appendage had gotten through his guard at some point. His uniform was, I'll say, damaged, and leave it there because some things don't need detail. General Vailtha was at the command post when he walked back in. She looked at him. He looked at her. East flank is clear, he said. She stared at him for a longer moment than I'd seen her stare at anything. Corporal, she said. Sir, are you injured? Superficially, he said, I'd like to get this wrapped. He held up his left arm. Then I can take a secondary position if you need one held. One of her aides, a young Saratai, not more than 2 years out of the academy, made a sound that I think was the Saratai equivalent of a person putting their head down on a desk. Vailtha, to her credit, maintained composure. Stand by, she said. Get that arm looked at. He nodded and went to find the medic. Now the device. This is the part that nobody fully understood in the immediate aftermath, and that the Coalition Intelligence Division spent 3 months trying to figure out from the debris recovered in the passage afterward. The small personal device Darren had brought, the one he'd built himself, turned out to be a signal emitter tuned to a very specific frequency range. A frequency range that corresponded to something the choir does when one of their units is, and I'm going to use the clinical term here because it's the only one that doesn't sound strange, dying, expiring, in the process of final cessation. The choir communicates. They send signals through their coordination system, and when a choir unit is in its final moments, it sends a very specific signal, a kind of cessation broadcast, a last transmission. Darren had built a device that broadcast that signal continuously, which means that for the entire 17-minute engagement in that passage, the choir formation was receiving, from a signal source moving through the cloud in front of them, the continuous broadcast of what their own coordination system interpreted as something in its final moments of existence. The xenobiologists who analyzed this afterward didn't know what to do with that. The Coalition Intelligence Division classified the device specs at their highest clearance level. What it did was something nobody had been able to fully predict, because nobody had thought to try it. It confused the choir's tactical response system. The choir doesn't attack dying things. There's something in their behavior pattern that's the equivalent of withdrawing from a signal source broadcasting cessation. Maybe it's efficiency. Maybe it's something closer to a behavior that doesn't translate cleanly. But moving through that cloud, broadcasting that signal, meant the leading edge of the choir formation kept pausing, not stopping entirely, but hesitating, flinching in whatever way a choir unit flinches. And Darren Voss, who had spent years in a hospice understanding what the end of life looked and sounded and moved like, who had sat with more death than most soldiers would ever see, and had paid close, compassionate attention to every detail of it, had translated that understanding into a frequency range. He'd built a machine that spoke the language of dying, and he'd walked through 14 choir units broadcasting it. I don't know what to call that. I really don't. The extraction went clean. The evacuation transports reached the civilian cluster with 6 minutes to spare inside the window. 4,600 people loaded and cleared. The remaining choir formations, including the large northern formation that Vailtha's main line had been holding, disengaged when the station's structural integrity started failing in the outer rings, which the choir apparently recognized as making the position no longer worth holding. We got out. All 93 combat personnel, we got out. That's not always how it ends. Anyone who tells you that's always how it ends has never been in one of these engagements. We got out, and it mattered, and I'm not going to be blasé about it. In the debrief transport, I sat near the back and watched Darren get his arm wrapped by the medic. A young woman named Tanaka who kept glancing at him with an expression I can only describe as trying to resolve an inconsistency. "Does that hurt?" she asked, applying the tissue seal. "A bit," he said. "You're pretty calm about it." "I've been through worse," he said. She paused. "What was worse?" He thought about it. "Losing a patient," he said, "when you've done everything right and you still lose them." Tanaka was quiet for a moment. "You were a nurse." "Hospice," he said. She looked at his arm, at the damage to his uniform, at the calmness in his face. "And then you enlisted," she said. "Yeah. Why?" He looked at the small device he'd placed on the seat beside him. The signal emitter, the dying language machine. "Because the choir doesn't stop," he said. "And someone has to know how to be in the same space as something that doesn't stop and stay clear-headed about it." He picked up the device and turned it over in his hands. "I used to sit with people when they were afraid," he said. "When the pain was bad and they didn't know what was coming next. The job was to be steady, to not let your own fear get in the room." He looked at Tanaka. "That's the same job," he said, "just different room." She didn't say anything. Neither did I. General Vailtha found him during the transit. She made her way through the transport to where he was sitting, which was notable because generals generally don't make their way through transports. Things come to them. She sat across from him, which put her long-limbed Saratai frame in a slightly awkward position relative to the human-scale seating, and she looked at him for a moment. "Corporal Voss," she said. "Sir?" "I've been trying," she said, "to write the incident report for the East Flank engagement. I can give you specifics if—" "That's not the difficulty," she said. "The difficulty is the classification." She paused. "I have to classify what you did, categorize it, put it in the correct reporting column." He waited. "I've reviewed the categories," she said. "I've gone through the coalition engagement taxonomy. There's no classification that accurately describes what the sensors recorded." He looked at her. "The closest match," she said, "is something in the coalition military dictionary that was last applied during a conflict over 300 of your years ago. A designation for soldiers who operated in environments and under conditions that exceeded standard engagement parameters." She paused. "The galactic standard translation is roughly those who walk in the ending." Something moved across his face. Not quite discomfort, not quite recognition, something in between. "I didn't know the coalition military had a category for that," he said. "We rarely needed it," she said. "The category exists because some cultures produced soldiers who required it. We encountered them twice in our history before today." She was quiet for a moment. "Once was a species called the V. heron, who were extinct by the time we found their records. The other time was approximately 200 years ago, during a conflict I won't detail here, with a species that we eventually established an armistice with." She looked at him with all four eyes, fully attentive. "And now," she said, "I'm going to add humans to that category." Darren was quiet. "I want to be clear," he said, "about what I did today. It wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not a weapon. What I did today was the same thing I always try to do, which is stay calm in a hard situation and use what I know. I've had a lot of practice being in hard situations." "I know," she said. "I'm not something to be deployed," he said. "I'm a soldier who had a skill set that matched a problem, that's all." She looked at him for a long moment. "Corporal," she said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I'm saying it with complete honesty and not as flattery." He waited. "When I reviewed your file," she said, "I saw 6 engagements and a survival record. I saw a qualification list that was unusual but not inexplicable. I saw a background in hospice care, which I noted as interesting but didn't fully weight correctly." She paused. "What I didn't see, what I didn't understand, was that the hospice care wasn't incidental. It was central. Everything you are as a soldier is downstream of that." She let that settle. "You spent years," she said, "in the presence of endings, not fighting them, not preventing them, being with them. And you came to understand endings the way that most soldiers never do, because most soldiers spend all their energy trying to stay away from that understanding. He was very still. And so when you built that device, she said, and when you walked into that passage, you weren't doing something that any trained soldier could do with enough preparation. You were doing something that required a specific kind of knowledge, a specific kind of peace with something that most beings in this coalition spend their entire lives refusing to look at directly. She sat back. I trusted you because you survived 6 engagements, she said. I was right to trust you. But I trusted you for the wrong reason. He looked at her. You should have trusted him, he said. And I noticed the pronoun shift, the slight separation, like he was talking about someone who shared his body but wasn't entirely the same person. Because he's willing to go where the ending is and do the work that needs doing there. Veltha was quiet for a long time. Yes, she said finally, that's exactly what I should have understood. She stood up, looked down at him. The classification, she said, is going in as Reaper class engagement capability. It's a new sub-designation. You'll be the first human on record to carry it. He looked slightly uncomfortable. I'd rather just be a corporal, he said. You'll be both, she said. Get some rest, Corporal. She made her way back toward the command section. Resolution. The Marath Station operation was written up by Coalition Command as a successful rapid insertion extraction with minimal casualties. 13 wounded, 0 fatalities on our side, 4,607 civilians extracted. 13 wounded was good. For a choir engagement that stretched 45 minutes past its extraction window, 13 wounded was exceptional. General Veltha's report was filed with the East Flank engagement classified under the new sub-designation. The Coalition Intelligence Division, when they read it, apparently convened an emergency session that lasted most of a day. The debate, from what I heard later, wasn't about Darren specifically. It was about what his existence implied. If one human, trained as a hospice nurse and then as a soldier, could build a device that communicated with the choir's cessation response system and use it to hold a passage against a 14-unit formation, what did that mean for the Coalition's understanding of the choir? What did it mean for the Coalition's understanding of humans? What did it mean for the war? These were large questions, the kind that take a long time to answer. In the shorter term, in the more immediately practical term, Darren Voss got a field promotion to sergeant, which he accepted without visible enthusiasm, and was assigned to a new unit that the Coalition was quietly putting together based on what the Marath engagement had demonstrated. A unit focused on the kinds of problems that the standard engagement taxonomy didn't have good language for. He asked me if I wanted to transfer with him. I thought about it for about 4 seconds. Yes, I said. He nodded like he'd expected that. You're going to need to be comfortable with some uncomfortable situations, he said. I've been in 17 engagements, I said. This will be different, he said. The situations will be quieter. I found out what he meant by that over the next 18 months. Quieter situations, narrower passages, darker corridors. The kind of work that doesn't make it into the big reports, but that the big reports couldn't happen without. I went back to find Vel, the Saratai scout, who'd been on our team in the maintenance corridor, who'd watched Darren walk back from the junction after those 7 scouts, and asked what he'd done before the war. I found Vel in the transport's back section, doing the Saratai thing of sitting perfectly still with all 4 eyes half closed, which was either meditation or the Saratai equivalent of a nap. Hard to tell. Vel, I said. His eyes opened. Sergeant Brennan. That thing you asked Darren in the corridor. Yes. Healthcare, he said. Yes. I sat down across from him. Did you believe him? Vel considered this. For a Saratai, consideration looks like very slow blinking. I believed that he believed it, Vel said finally, and then I thought about what healthcare means. What it requires, proximity to suffering, sustained proximity, the decision made repeatedly to enter spaces where something is ending and to remain in those spaces until the work is done. He looked at me. And I thought, Vel said, that the choir has been winning this war because most species cannot make that decision, cannot remain in the space. The choir presses forward, and most beings either fight and die or flee and survive. He paused. But the humans who can stay in the space, the ones who have made peace with what that space contains, they are something the choir has no model for. He closed his eyes again. Healthcare, he said almost to himself. Remarkable. The last thing I want to tell you is something that didn't make it into any report. Not the debrief, not the intelligence briefing, not the general's write-up. This is just something I saw on the transport about 3 hours into the transit back to the coalition staging point. It was late station time late, the kind where half the transport was asleep or close to it. I was sitting near the front of the passenger section, not sleeping, doing that thing where you're too tired to sleep because your body hasn't finished processing what it went through. I could see Darren a few rows back. He had the small device, the signal emitter, in his hands. He wasn't doing anything with it, just holding it, turning it over slowly. He had an expression on his face that I hadn't seen from him during any of the engagement. During the planning, during the corridor, during the debrief, during the conversation with General Vailtha. He'd been steady through all of it, that particular stillness of his that made you feel like the ceiling was lower when he was in the room. But now, with the device in his hands and half the transport asleep around him, he looked not broken, nothing that dramatic. He looked like someone who'd done something necessary and was sitting quietly with the weight of it. The way, I imagine, a hospice nurse looks at the end of a shift. Not destroyed, not fine, just present with the weight of it, not putting it down, not pushing it away, not pretending it wasn't there. Just holding it the way you hold something that matters. He sat like that for a while. Then he placed the device carefully in the inner pocket of his uniform, close, the way you keep something you don't want to lose, and he leaned his head back against the seat, and he closed his eyes. And within about 2 minutes, he was asleep. Just like that. Like a man who'd learned a long time ago how to rest in the spaces between hard things. Like a man who understood that the work would be there when he woke up, and so the sleeping mattered just as much. I watched him for a moment, and then I leaned my own head back and I closed my eyes. Ending line. I've told this story a dozen times, and people always ask me the same question at the end. They ask, did she really trust the wrong human? And I have to think about that every time, because the answer is complicated. She trusted him because she thought he was a superior survivor, a soldier who'd been through 6 engagements and walked out of all of them, which in the coalition engagement statistics is notable. She trusted him as a military resource, which is how coalition generals think about people, which isn't wrong but isn't all of it either. What she got was something she hadn't trusted him to be, hadn't known to trust him to be. She got a man who had spent years learning how to be in the room when things end, who had decided, very deliberately, to make himself useful in that specific and terrible space, who had taken everything he'd learned about how death works, its rhythms, its sounds, its communications, and turned it into something that could be carried in a pocket and deployed in a corridor. She trusted the wrong thing. She got the right man. And the choir, which had been advancing through 3-star systems, with nothing that could make it hesitate, met something in a 63-meter passage on Marath Station that its coordination system had no category for. A human carrying a machine that spoke the language of ending. Walking toward them, without hurrying. That's the thing about Reapers, I think, in the quiet moments before sleep, when the weight of 17, now 31, engagement settles over me like a familiar blanket. They were never the ones running away from the end. They were just the ones who'd made their peace with it first,